Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another session of Unpacking Bedside Bioethics. My name is Jamie Connerman Cease, and I'm a clinical ethics assistant professor here at the Center for Bioethics at the University of Minnesota. We're very excited for our webinar today. The Unpacking Bedside Bioethics is a quarterly webinar series that focuses on a range of bioethics topics that impact clinical work. Today, our session will focus on slow codes and much more beyond that. That's just the bare minimum. We're so excited for our speaker today, but before I introduce him, I want to talk through a couple of housekeeping issues. So, the first thing is that if you are part of the mHealth Fairview system, our center provides 24/7 ethics consultation to you. Anyone can request an ethics consult. You can reach out to us on our secure messaging platform, Vocera, the Clinical Ethics Consultation Group. Contact us anytime. It's a 24/7 service for inpatients. So we look forward to you connecting us there. So I do want to express that the views presented by this webinar speaker is his own. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the Center for Bioethics faculty. The Center for Bioethics faculty do not take positions on specific issues. And for the hosting and posting online of webinars does not imply endorsement of any views expressed by the speakers. So if you are joining us virtually live, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions to let our center staff know if you're having technical difficulties. We do provide a recording of this webinar. That recording is available through YouTube. It will also be sent out to you in a post-session email. If you need captions, you can enable those captions below by clicking captions and then show captions. We really appreciate your evaluations for this session. So there are 4 ways to access an evaluation after this webinar is over. A web browser will pop up. It is also linked in the presentation details document, which is now in the chat. You will also receive an email, and additionally, you can scan the QR code here or at the end of the session. We do offer credit. So if you are looking for credit, we offer certificates of attendance for CEUs. Please get those in within 1 week after the live event. After this, the form will be closed and no further submissions will be accepted. Find that through the presentation's details document. Also, if you are a University of Minnesota student who is an interprofessional student, you can participate in our credit discussion, 15-minute post-event discussion. That is also linked in the presentation details chat. If you're a biomedical engineering student, you can receive credit for attending this webinar through the Canvas page. And all of these credit opportunities require at least 75% of attendance at the live webinar. If you have questions about follow-up, you can email our general Center for Bioethics email, which can be found below here on the website or on our website as well. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Jason Adam Wasserman. Dr. Wasserman is the professor in the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry, where he also serves as Director of Education. We're very excited to have Jason here to present on the ethics of slow codes. This is something that he has written about and spoken about to many groups, and it's been a fantastic conversation both within bioethics and within the larger world of medicine on how we should be thinking about code status and DNR. So now I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Wasserman, to lead us into this conversation today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think the disclaimer about these opinions being my own and not representative of the University of Minnesota, the Bioethics Center there, have probably never been more important because, of course, this slow codes are particularly controversial, arguably illegal, and it's gonna involve quite a bit of controversial terrain today. I will say my own position on that is the slow codes, as you'll come to see, is really confined to a bit of a narrower context that maybe people won't find as controversial. I'll say also at the outset that my dear colleague Parker Crutchfield and I have a special issue in bioethics dedicated to kind of novel approaches to the slow code. And there's just a number of tremendous articles in there, including Parker's. I'll touch on several of them today, but I'd certainly kind of want to acknowledge his work in this space because we've done so much collaborative work on it as well. First, disclosures. I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose, but I will off this slide also say another bit of disclaimer. I serve as a clinical ethics consultant, and I always like to make clear at the beginning of this presentation that I never recommend a slow code in the context of clinical ethics consultation, recognizing that they violate all sorts of norms, practices, and laws. But I do think, especially in the context that we'll discuss today, ethical disobedience to judicial and legislative overreach, that they represent an interesting discussion that crystallizes a lot of concerns, certainly about code status and resuscitation attempts and futility, and the sort of nexus of all of those concerns, but I think also about the broader socio-political landscape, in which medicine exists, and in which ethics navigates kind of medical decision making between a profession and the public. There's I think an interesting specific topic, surrounding the slow codes, but I think that branches off into a variety of bread and butter issues that are really important for us to be discussing today. And I think that's probably why, much to my surprise, this is currently my most requested talk. When I published my piece on this, my only piece on this, I thought this is kind of a niche one-off that is kind of exercising some thoughts I had around a case, which we'll talk about in a second. And that would be that. And it turns out it's arguably struck a nerve with more people than I had expected. And I think that it's not so much because of the question about slow codes themselves, but because it pulls on all of those different threads. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to describe the sort of dilemma that gives rise to the use of slow codes. We'll identify and evaluate some different arguments around that. And then I'll focus in on my sort of, as I said, more narrow contention about slow codes as a form of ethical disobedience. And I'll conclude with some newer stuff that really responds to critiques that we got when we published our special issue, specifically around the question of whether time-limited trials of futile or inappropriate CPR represent an ethical compromise that might help us evade the need for slow codes in the first place. I think that they don't do that. So that's the plan. But I always like starting with cases, but that's especially genuine in this particular instance because my thoughts on this really emerged from a particular case that we had. Obviously, I've changed the HIPAA protected information here, but this was basically the case. So in this case, NDC is a 91-year-old woman who suffered a stroke at a long-term care facility. CPR was initiated, it shouldn't say family, by staff within 2 minutes, and EMS took over around the 5-minute mark. She was successfully resuscitated at the hospital within 21 minutes of chest compressions, or after 21 minutes of chest compressions. And she was evaluated as likely being in a minimally conscious state at first, though with no verbalization or gestural responses. Indeed, her only demonstration of cognitively mediated behavior involved lifting her right arm in response to requests, but this occurred only on 2 occasions, early in the hospitalization, and really never again for the remainder of the 8-week hospitalization. Things sort of were declining. The medical staff, including multiple attending physicians and consultants, unanimously viewed CPR as non-beneficial and likely harmful given her skeletal frailties and other comorbidities. She had a history of stroke and a whole range of other things. But the family adamantly refused to consent to a DNAR order. Following the hospital's policy on futile non-beneficial care, the ICU team worked through a multi-stage review process, attempting to work with the family repeatedly, but eventually a DNAR order was entered over the family's objection. The family subsequently took the hospital to probate court, where a judge ruled against the hospital, stating that the guardian had the power to revoke a do not resuscitate order under state law. I'll get to whether that's an appropriate reading of the law or not. But while the issue was under appeal, the patient suffered cardiac arrest, and rapid response team dutifully initiated maximal vasopressor support, cardioversion, and chest compressions, which reportedly fractured her ribs. She was initially resuscitated before coding again in just a matter of hours. More chest compressions and cardioversion failed to restart her heart at that point in time. And this case sort of motivated me to think about the role of slow codes vis-a-vis, in this case, judicial, but also legislative overreach, because it seems so tragic to me that despite our best efforts, despite really good communication from the team, despite long efforts to convey to family her physiological state, the inappropriateness of CPR, we were effectively ordered by a court to do chest compressions on this woman. And I found that very, very troubling. And it kind of gave rise to thoughts in me about, oh man, maybe a slow code would have been better. Maybe it would have been better for everyone. And maybe it would have been ethical in the context of being forced by a judge with no medical training to perform these interventions. And so that's sort of the case that motivated my thoughts about this topic. So the ethical conflict is, fairly straightforward. When we confront cases of futile or inappropriate CPR, we're really faced with three options. We can perform the harmful interventions, right? We can just do it. And I think that happens quite a bit. In fact, I think it happens so often, as I'll get to towards the end, that we've become sort of desensitized to futile or not beneficial, not medically inappropriate CPR. Or we can unilaterally refuse, as the healthcare team tried to do in this case. And this, of course, should involve a fair process for ethical review and all of that. But ultimately, most hospitals have policies that provide a mechanism for doing that. But of course, that can run up against, as we saw, judicial opinion. And in some places, it's simply not legal because of the laws around consent for CPR. The third option, of course, is to do something deceptive. And I'm not going to mix words about that. Slow codes are dishonest and deceptive. And of course, the downside here is that violates the transparency and honesty that we expect in ethical medical practice. But all of these, I think, are troubling in different ways. And some of them, again, get taken off the table in the larger socio-political landscape. So we'll define some terms before we get to some arguments around the ethical permissibility or not of slow codes. There are a lot of different terms that refer to different kinds of deceptive or non-transparent code practices. Erica Andrist and colleagues in our special issue have a great article that actually provides a taxonomy of these. The two dominant ones are show codes and slow codes. Show codes involve sort of a charade of intentionally simulating different kinds of or different parts of the code that might be seeming to do compressions, but not doing them, deep enough to be therapeutic. I've heard multiple now. You might imagine since publishing this, I hear a lot of stories. I've heard multiple people describe shooting epinephrine into the mattress as opposed to the patient. These would be show codes. They're sometimes called Hollywood codes or fake codes. More technically, the term slow code refers to a kind of protocol of sorts where the team simply takes their time getting there. But both of these ultimately for the same purposes is that no one wants to resuscitate the patient. There's an intentional attempt not to be effective with the CPR. There's a bunch of additional variants, a family code, which and these are overlapping. So sometimes people talk about family code. This is generally calls out a piece of the puzzle here that highlights that the code is being done for the family's benefit, not the patient. A contained code or partial code, a la carte code, is something similar. A faux code might be done in agreement with a patient, but over or kind of working around the family. There are a whole bunch of different variants. I'm going to use the term slow code just as an umbrella term for any insincere performative attempt at cardiopulmonary resuscitation done with either the knowledge or intention that the patient cannot or should not be resuscitated. So this covers instances of futility. It covers medically inappropriate interventions. But the sort of baseline there is that when the team has a sincere belief that CPR is either futile or inappropriate, and they don't feel empowered or are prevented in some way from not attempting CPR, and they therefore do something deceptive in the process, I'm going to call that a slow code, recognizing, of course, that there are different terms that call out different elements of that. Uh, Relatedly, just to be clear about the terms, I'm going to just use the standard distinction between physiological futility and medically inappropriate interventions as really highlighted in the Five Societies statement, such that physiological futility, when I say that, I'll mean, or when I just say futility in this presentation, I'll mean an intervention that cannot achieve its physiological goals. And medically inappropriate, I'll use to refer to an intervention that could achieve its physiological goals, but where there's an ethically compelling reason not to do that. And in most of these cases, that ethically compelling reason is that it causes more burden than benefit, more harm than offsetting therapeutic benefit to the patient. So, a little bit of review about how we got here and what is happening in the space of CPR and slow codes. Bob Baker has a wonderful piece in 1995 that really talks about the history of CPR policies and how in the 1970s, when CPR becomes routine and presumptive, you immediately start to see these kinds of workarounds, right? So euphemisms emerge in the medical record, or as it was on paper back then, things like NPBR, which in reality meant not to be resuscitated, but where plausible deniability let the team suggest that it meant no temperature by rectal, right? So this is a sort of deceptive practice. There's famous purple dot stickers that get put on the charts of patients that people thought probably shouldn't be resuscitated as a signal to perform a slow code. And a whole bunch of sort of stories about how people began, once CPR becomes routine, presumptive, and eventually legally mandated, the sort of the healthcare system, the clinical teams on the floors immediately respond to that by engaging in deceptive practices in an effort to practice what I would call it an effort to practice good medicine. Because frankly, the underlying situation sociopolitically cut against that, right? It was sort of maybe well-intentioned, but too ham-fisted to account for the clinical nuances that they were facing on the floor. And this is the sort of, I think, natural result. 88 in New York starts to require consent to institute a do not resuscitate order. And this triggers a surge in documented futile resuscitation attempts. And then that's kind of been, I think, in some states where it's mandated the case ever since, and in many states where the specter of legal liability hangs over the heads of clinicians nonetheless, even if it is legal to unilaterally work through a process to institute DNR. I think the specter of liability and conflict promotes quite a bit of futile resuscitation attempts. With respect to slow codes, despite for the last 40 years, there have been almost no ethical defenses of slow codes, save for one piece by John Lantos and Bill Meadows in 2011, and I'll get to that in a second. There's been sort of a unilateral chorus of voices decrying them as unethical, and despite that, they remain common in critical care settings. So Bob Baker notes that in response to the 1988 consent law in New York, immediately there after that, 39% of critical care nursing directors reported an increase in futile ACLS interventions. 35% felt they could not write medically appropriate DNR orders over family ambivalence or guardian refusal. And 56% of ICU medical directors reported that show and slow codes increased or at least stayed the same after these reforms. So likely trending upward. And I don't want the real impact of this in terms of moral injury and moral distress to be lost in the statistics. So also in our special issue, Patty Mayer writes a really touching narrative piece of her experiences with, I think, ultimately CPR in the context of it becoming routine, even in cases where it was futile or inappropriate, and ultimately about witnessing a slow code. But I just pulled this one quote. I was sick of running codes where everyone died. I don't remember ever coding a patient when I was in training and hearing they later walked out of the hospital or even just left the hospital alive, ever. And so I think in the context of very ill people, it can be morally distressing for staff to continue to provide aggressive interventions and to engage in futile attempts at CPR, which can be devastating to the body. I think these have profound effects on morale and the future decision-making of the healthcare team, including a willingness to stand up for professional values in future cases. And I think what we see when we see deceptive practices emerge around that, it's sort of natural backfill to a social system, a socio-political and legal system that doesn't accommodate medical judgment properly. So as I said, the ethical canon on slow codes has been quite homogenous over the last 40 years, almost 50 years. Slow codes are basically universally decried as unethical across the literature, again, with the one exception that I'll get to. And for numerous reasons and good reasons, right? Slow codes are fundamentally dishonest. Again, I'm not going to mince words about that. They're paternalistic. Even if they're well-intentioned, the choice is made for the family without their knowledge or meaningful consent. And of course, that's effectively the definition of paternalism. There are arguments that they can erode trust, right? That should, of course, this deception become known, that the public might lose confidence in medicine and things that are disclosed to them. And I think especially what you see is the claim that if we just had better communication with families, if we just did a better job educating them about the physiological state of their loved one and the inappropriateness or futility of CPR, if we were just better at that, that would obviate the need for slow codes. Or similarly, if our non-beneficial care policies were just better, stronger, clearer, etc., then we wouldn't need them. And so this idea that if we were doing a better job, we wouldn't need to engage in slow codes. So I think these four arguments pretty well capture this sort of uniform chorus of voices over the last 40 years. But that brings us to our sort of dilemma that partly provoked this talk, because I certainly appreciate the need for better communication with patients, stronger non-beneficial care policies, fully endorse all efforts to harmonize the clinical situation, to avoid the conflict with better communication, to create fair practices that are stable and reliable for practicing good medicine. But the bottom line is that those don't solve all of these problems. And in the case I presented, and without, I'm not backward, sort of backward projecting, I thought that the team did an absolutely phenomenal job working for a very long time with that family to try to get them to understand the clinical situation, the troubling prospect of CPR. We had a good non-beneficial care policy. They worked through it very deliberatively. We had buy-in from the administration. I mean, I couldn't imagine what didn't go right in that situation, and yet we ran into a barrier that prevented us from, I think, doing what we thought was the right thing to do. Despite the course of voices decrying slow codes over the last 40 years, the contemporary data on slow codes shows that they're still relatively common. That doesn't mean frequent, but they occur more frequently than people might expect, given that there seems to be no justification in the literature for them. Again, minus one article in 2011. So Gina Piscatello and colleagues surveyed critical care clinicians, physicians, and nurses, and 69% of them reported a slow coded or performed on a patient under their care. On average, they have reported witnessing 1.3 slow codes per year. And so despite decades of condemnation, this is still happening on the floors. 95% agreed that ACLS can be medically futile, and 52% of the people surveyed said that slow codes can be ethical if CPR is medically futile. So not only does the data suggest that this is still happening? It suggests that those on the ground don't have the same, certainly not the same level of homogeneity with respect to ethical condemnation of the practice as the ethicists and physician ethicists writing in the journals. So what we have is a real disconnect between the ethics canon as in print and ethics practice on the floors. And I think that gives rise to a very interesting discussion. Why is this happening? And I don't think that that discussion can, I think an important piece of that discussion involves the broader socio-political landscape in which we're operating, which is what I'll get to. But first, let's run through a few arguments or arguments on all different arguments for, neutral, and against the slow code. So arguments against slow codes at the top line there is the things that I've already covered, that they're inherently deceptive, they violate norms of honesty, they're paternalistic, they can erode public trust, they're unnecessary if we just do a better job. Right? Those are the classic arguments that cut across many, many publications. In our special issues, and we specifically, because we solicited novel analyses of slow codes, Tarasenko Struck talks more about the objectification of the patient, arguing that they're wrong because slow codes inherently treat the patient as a means to satiating the family, to trying to palliate their complicated grief, etc., or to the clinical team trying to prevent them from having to engage in a distressing conflict with the family, but they're not for the benefit of the patient. And McLennan and others have, sort of took the idea of doing a better job, but sort of, engaged it at a structural level, which I think is really an important point. That these structural conditions, as I said, and as I'll dive into more, are generating the situation in which, in theory, we shouldn't be doing this thing, and in practice, it's still happening quite a bit. So they argued for removing CPR as a mandatory default, enabling context-sensitive bedside decisions, and sort of backing medical judgment in those contexts, and adopting treatment escalation plans rather than binary CPR and DNR orders, all systemic reforms that may, I think, impact the need to engage in these types of practices. Some other arguments against that I put under the category here of alternative proposals, like what we should do instead. Alex Kahn has written about informed non-dissent as an alternative, which is where we basically tell families CPR won't be informed unless they object within a particularly in the conversation usually. This basically shifts the choice architecture and such that the default is an informational model rather than kind of the like shared decision making under false pretenses. And I think this is a wonderful idea. I think informed non-dissent is a great clinical strategy in all sorts of different situations, but of course, it doesn't answer the question of what to do when they object. Ladd and Foreman talk about transparent slow codes, which means you explicitly inform families that CPR will be limited in duration and intensity, which they argue maintains honesty while setting expectations. I don't think that that's fundamentally honest, because I think that families will misunderstand the therapeutic effectiveness of what you're offering them, and I think you're signaling something to them by your willingness to do certain things that's still false. And then Morrison and Footner and Javier and Barrington both argue for what they call alternately short and appropriate codes, which is basically a time-limited trial of a quick time-limited attempt at CPR. And I'm going to return to this in depth later, because after we published this special issue, this was the number one sort of critique that we heard from people, which is that this is a better, a more ethical compromise in these situations. So I'm going to come back to that specifically in a little bit. Kind of neutral, but interesting and important, Grosso and Nicholas point out that, while slow codes certainly are deceptive, deception isn't in and of itself something we always resist in the context of healthcare. And they question whether slow codes are uniquely deceptive in some way we should be concerned about, or some way that would motivate this sort of uniformity of opposition. And they suggest that no, they're not, right? They are deceptive, and that doesn't answer the question about whether they're ethical, and it's certainly broadly, but also in particular cases. But the mere fact that they're deceptive isn't a defeater in and of itself, because we engage in all sorts of ethical deception in the context of healthcare. And then has a really interesting empirical piece which surveys respondents from the public about slow codes. And interestingly, because remember, one of the key oppositions to slow codes is that will undermine public trust. Is that will undermine public trust, but this research suggests that maybe not as much as we think. The majority of respondents in the survey actually thought that slow codes would be a permissible option. Okay, so in terms of defending slow codes, these articles are few and far between. The most notable exception is John Lantos and Bill Meadows' limited defense of slow codes in the 2011 issue of American Journal of Bioethics. And they basically said slow codes may be justifiable in this gray space type of situation where CPR is clearly futile, families understand death is inevitable, and they can't bring themselves to consent to DNR, but they've indicated that they understand it's the right thing, right? So they just can't consent in a sort of a formal way, but they've indicated that they really kind of know that, right? And so this is a relatively limited use of slow codes in a very particular situation. I think not wrong, but narrowly constrained by the sort of criteria that they layer around it. What's more interesting to me actually is that this was roundly rejected. Not one single open peer commentary that was published alongside this target article of 13 really endorsed this position or suggested that they might be right. Again, they invoked honesty, integrity, and public trust. But again, also many, I think, simply avoided the underlying dilemma, suggesting that in such situations, we just ought to communicate better, right? And I guess I think ultimately we can communicate really, really well and still end up in this situation at least some of the time. So we have to figure out what our response is going to be. And my colleague, as a broader defense, my colleague Parker Crutchfield has framed slow codes as a trolley problem and argued that in fact it may be the most ethical choice. I won't go through the arguments in detail, but effectively it's a harm reduction claim, a consequentialist sort of utilitarian analysis that slow codes in the grand scheme of things avoid conflict and avoid the harms associated with futile or inappropriate CPR, and they may actually then be the most ethical choice. Okay, so let's talk about my own somewhat narrowly conscripted context for when I think slow codes might be ethical, and that's as a form of ethical disobedience. I want to start off by saying that I think that the critics of slow codes are correct. They're dishonest. They're unpalatable at a minimum, and we should wish for a world in which they were unnecessary. And I certainly do. And in a vacuum, slow codes are clearly wrong. But medicine isn't practiced in a vacuum. And in fact, it's practiced in the context of a socio-political landscape that is increasingly, I think, not sufficiently deferential to what expertise means, to clinical judgment, to medical evidence. And if you're paying attention to the current landscape, socio-political landscape, I think that we're seeing deference to pluralism in spaces of expertise of health science that is troubling, and that we have to start to think about how to respond to that to preserve the integrity of medicine, and certainly the ability of physicians to practice good medicine. So in the context specifically that I'll talk about is the context of judicial and legislative overreach, where, as you saw in my first case, futile or inappropriate CPR is effectively mandated. I think that a slow code might be ultimately an ethical act of disobedience against an unethical system. So there's a variety of different ways in which legislative and judicial overreach can interfere with good medical judgments. Ambiguous statutes, even in places that theoretically don't prohibit unilateral DNRs, through a non-beneficial treatment policy process, like we had in Michigan. So here is a quote from Michigan health law, which says that guardians, quote, have the power to execute, reaffirm, and revoke a do not resuscitate order. And in the case that I started with, the judge ruled against the hospital because they read this, I think, out of context to say that only a guardian has such powers. Of course, this ignores other places in the law where medical orders can only be issued by a physician and so forth. And I think if you put the whole picture together, it certainly does not override physician's ability to determine CPR futile or inappropriate and to withhold the offer of it. But as some of my legal ethics colleagues have told me, in a judge's courtroom, they are the law and they're never wrong when they render a judgment against you. And so in that case, regardless of whether I read the law differently, we were bound by the court order. And I think that situation is amplified when state statutes are ambiguous. Bureaucratic paralysis. So there are state laws regulating in hospital DNR, or even, I should say, even when there are pathways, sometimes there are strictures around the pathways to unilateral DNR that are so restrictive and landmine ridden that physicians don't want to even bother navigating the intricacies of that. And relatedly, sometimes, while I think hospitals and physicians usually win on questions of medical judgment in court, they often do so after temporary injunctions have extended the judicial process quite a long time. And so despite, as that Pope writes, despite statutory authorization and grants of immunity, providers are chilled from unilaterally stopping treatment because of the legal uncertainties interjected by that kind of bureaucratic paralysis and these types of temporary injunctions. In other words, even where the law doesn't explicitly prohibit it or judges don't haven't explicitly ruled against the hospital or physician, there is a specter of liability, both civil and legal, statutory, in these cases that I think is not unreasonable for physicians to worry about. And I think it promotes quite a bit of acquiescence to futile or inappropriate interventions, particularly in the space of CPR, which enjoys this sort of perverse status as a default medical intervention on offer. There's instances in other states, even where, like, as I said, there are states in which it's not prohibited. There are states in which it is. So the New York law generally held that physicians must try to resuscitate without family consent. This is a quote from an article, and they were actually describing, I think quoting, maybe not in this exact quote, but Joe Finn's and his experiences during the pandemic, navigating the sort of strictures of the law around very, very sick individuals with, bilateral pneumonia from COVID that still had to be subjected to CPR. So I want to make a two-part argument about this. And the first part is relatively straightforward, or maybe, is that mandated CPR that cuts against medical judgment, and I think really even standard of care in some cases, is unethical. The second part of that may be a little bit more controversial, and that we should not obey that. I think if a resuscitation attempt is futile or medically inappropriate, it falls outside the standard of care, and there's a moral obligation to provide the standard of care. Legislative and judicial mandates compelling people to do otherwise are therefore unethical. So in part two is that slow codes are an ethically permissible method of disobedience in those cases. And for that, I'll dive deeper using Jim Childress's framework for assessing illegal actions in healthcare. So let's do that. So Childress lays out a four-part model for evaluating ethical disobedience. And actually, he first delineates three categories. This fits best, I think, under the category of what he calls evasive noncompliance. If there's questions about like whether it's conscientious objection or whatever, we can address that in the Q&A period. But evasive noncompliance requires a four-part justification according to this framework, in which we must examine the ends. It means that the outcome of the disobedience must be justifiable from a consequentialist point of view. It must produce good things. It must be the action of last resort. You can't just jump to it. You have to try other non-disobedient means of resolving the situation. We should look at the consequences of the act for the objector. There should be, what will happen to them as a result of this evasive non-compliance. And then most importantly, and I think most complicated, we have to examine the type and form of the disobedience, which in this case would be the deceptive slow code. So we'll go through the first one, three relatively quickly, and then spend some time on whether the deception of a slow code is a justifiable method. So first, I think examining the ends of a slow code in the context of futile or medically inappropriate CPR comes out favorable. It protects the staff from moral distress and moral injury when they're compelled to act against deeply held values. It protects the patient from futile or medically inappropriate CPR, and it preserves medical integrity against judicial and legislative overreach. I think it's clearly in most or all cases a object of last resort, at least in the grand scheme of things. So in some cases, for example, like the one I mentioned, slow codes are performed under active court injunctions, meaning there have been attempts to work within the system. In the case that you saw, which again was a real life case, we made every attempt to work through the system to, illustrate a fair process of review and stand our ground on medical judgment, and it simply didn't work. Some statutes already kind of explicitly prohibit unilateral code status changes, so it, I think, becomes kind of a de facto last resort at that point. And the time-sensitive nature of arrest doesn't really leave a lot of time in many cases for these types of appeals. So I think in many, if not all cases, the slip code ends up being a last resort. The consequences. I think the surreptitious nature, the deceptive nature of the slow code actually amplifies its permissibility on this criterion. Again, it reduces harm to the patient, reduces staff's moral distress, but it's unlikely to result in sanctions. Again, these are performed with a fair degree of regularity, and yet, as far as I could tell, there's not been a sanction levied against the physician for doing so, or a healthcare team. And also, and I think this counts in his favor, it doesn't disrupt the broader social order. So these sort of like renegade judges, like the one that we encountered, who I think are misinterpreting the law, but are rendering judgments nonetheless. And I think we would have won on appeal had we had that opportunity. But I think we can view some of that as idiosyncratic in some states, at least. And I think it's good that a slow code targets a particular situation and isn't disruptive to a larger social order. Now, there are other cases, other situations, particularly where there's legislated and statutory overreach, where maybe that's not that doesn't count in favor of slow codes. The type and form, I think, is the most challenging piece of this. So, of course, slow codes are deceptive. Right now, in their favor, they're nonviolent, they're directly responsive to unjust state intrusion, they are conscience-based, so they are motivated by genuinely held values, for example, not harming the patient or only doing those things that are therapeutic. But there's some other challenges there, obviously, most especially its deceptive and evasive nature. So let's dive in on that. The type and form. Why would the deception be justified? Well, I have sort of four arguments related to this. The first is that slow codes actually uphold a norm. They don't, in the context of judicial and legislative overreach. So slow codes as ethical disobedience. Again, not rendering a defense of slow codes generally here. But they actually uphold a norm. They don't violate one. So I think that they are an attempt to practice the standard of care, obviously in a modified way. They defend against these types of idiosyncratic judicial orders or this type of legislative overreach in defense of the standard of care. So they're defending a norm, not violating one. I think in the case of slow codes, publicity is not required. One argument is that they're in their evasiveness, they're not doing what civil disobedience does, which is It's disobedience that is not just about that moment, but it is designed to protest and change a social order. But I'm not sure that publicity is always required in every case of disobedience. Certainly, I'm willing to concede that slow codes don't count as civil disobedience, but whether they're ethical disobedience in the form of evasive noncompliance doesn't require publicity. And public attestation, of course, would carry significant professional risks with limited upside for systemic change, because I think these are really case dependent and in many cases idiosyncratic. At the same time, relatedly, there's nothing that says we can't advocate for reform, particularly in those states that have statutory prohibitions on that limit the ability to unilaterally withhold futile and inappropriate interventions. And it turns out that the public, as I mentioned, is not significantly opposed in the way that we at least thought. Certainly not at the rate of academic bioethicists over the last 40 years. But again, we can keep coming back to the fact that deception is unpalatable. I mean, there's no, again, as I've said multiple times, I'm not going to mince words about that. It is not a good feeling to stand here and defend a deceptive practice. And so I would agree with a basic claim, but I think futile CPR is also quite unpalatable. It's quite harmful to the body. It's distressing to the staff, and particularly in cases where it offers no therapeutic benefit, it's a net harm. Now, I'll dive further into kind of the harms analysis as we get to this last piece. So one of the responses that we've gotten to our work is that the right sort of mode to strike is, or the right response to demands for futile or inappropriate CPR is to use a time-limited code. As you saw before, there are a couple articles on appropriate or short codes. This would be where CPR is done to ACLS standards, appropriate depth of compressions, the full complement of medications, and all of the parts of a code, but where it's called off quickly as people say, when realize that it won't be effective, right? So Morrison and Footner write, for example, far better we believe that the resuscitation team engage in a short and circumscribed attempt at high quality, well-coordinated CPR with a team leader halting CPR efforts at an appropriate judgment or at appropriate juncture. And the case is that unlike a slow code, time-limited trials of CPR like this are sincere and transparent, that they mitigate the harms of CPR because they're short and give some relief to families who want everything done, that they're legal, unlike slow codes, and that reduce liability exposure. And a lot of people have said to us, well, you never know when you're going to resuscitate someone. So it's never, like, almost arguing that it's never truly futile. But I think actually all of these arguments fail. I think time-limited trials of futile or medically inappropriate CPR are not sincere or transparent. First of all, the arguments for probability are nihilistic and asymmetrical. The idea that, well, you never know is not a premise and a principle that we use other places in medicine, where insanely low probabilities of outcomes are indeed reasons not to offer interventions. In fact, if you want to get technical about it, because the medical evidence base is built out of sampled data, the statistical probabilities always approach zero, but can never be zero. And so in a technical sense, you can always say you never know, but we don't, because we make reasons, judgments around low probabilities all of the time. I don't think technical compliance is the same thing as sincerity, particularly if there's a prejudgment that the CPR will not be effective. Notice in this quote that the suggestion is we should attempt high quality, well-coordinated CPR, halting CPR efforts at an appropriate judgment. But high quality CPR seems to me to take as its prerequisite that it might be effective. It seems hard to justify that it's high quality if it's known in advance it cannot be effective, or if the probability is approaches zero. Additionally, the only truly appropriate duration for futile or medically inappropriate CPR is none. So it seems to me to be a bit of a contradiction. Disclosure is not transparency. So simply telling families, well, We think it's futile or inappropriate for these reasons, but we'll do it anyway. But now we've fulfilled our obligations to be transparent, I think is a bit contradictory because I think families, particularly those operating from a position of complex grief or unrealistic expectations, nonetheless ascribe meaning to the actions beyond sort of the words that are said to them. And so I think you're communicating something that is false through the action of a time-limited trial of CPR. And I think this sincerity obviously supposed sincerity comes at the cost of other commitments. And so on the consequentialist front, that the time-limited trial reduces the harms of CPR. I'll just say quickly, because I'm kind of approaching my time here, that I think also the evidence doesn't support this. Skeletal trauma in CPR begins right away. Other harms are also immediate. And it turns out that CPR, even in cases of futility, might actually cause some harm. And by that, there's an estimated 1 to 2% of cases involve CPR-induced consciousness, even when patients are not ultimately resuscitated. The compressions generate enough for the patient to experience the CPR attempt. The family benefit is unproven. The evidence that this attempt somehow satiates the family or allows them to not have regret because they tried everything doesn't seem to be borne out in any clear way in the data. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us at this place where sincerity would favor a unilateral DNR and a harm reduction would favor a slow code. And you can decide which of those you think is the most appropriate, but it seems to me that time-limited trials of CPR that has been prejudged to be futile or inappropriate don't achieve either of sincerity or harm reduction. So let me just conclude by reiterating the general framing here. I think ideal ethics asks the question, what is right? And it operates in a largely hypothetical space. And in that space, I think slow codes are fundamentally wrong. They violate honesty. They violate all sorts of medical norms, and they're clearly wrong. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a non-ideal world. And the question for non-ideal ethics is not what is right, but how can we make a flawed world a little bit better? And I think especially, and again, it's my narrow context, in the context of judicial and legislative overreach, where we've been mandated to do something that cuts against medical judgment, one way to make a flawed world a little bit better is potentially with a slow code. So we will.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wasserman. It's been a fantastic presentation and generated significant discussion in the Q&A. Significant, fantastic, thoughtful questions. There are three that I want to start with, and as attendees can get more questions in the chat, I'll do my best to pick out ones to answer as we have just a few minutes left. So first, this is a topic that came up quite a bit. This attendee asks, all codes are in some way dependent on clinical judgment, i.e., at some point, the team will decide to stop coding the patient.
Yep.
This clinical judgment is essential for non-beneficial or futile interventions. So why was your team not empowered to use that determination to not offer the code in the first place? I struggle to justify a slow code when there is an alternative method to prevent inappropriate care from being performed on a patient.
Yeah, I think if there is a viable alternative method, it's probably not justifiable. But as I said, in this case, we were mandated by a judge to do it. Now, you're correct that the team has the clinical judgment to call it off at a certain point in time. But now remember, we're under legal scrutiny. So when are they going to call it off? Well, they're going to at least do one round, right? I mean, they're not gonna they're going to do what seems to be defensible in the court in front of a particular judge. And but I think what your question underscores is something sort of ironic about the entire situation, which is everyone recognizes that the team can stop the code when they determine it won't be effective. Yet there seems to be quite a bit of controversy around not offering CPR when it's determined not to be effective, as though the sort of like chronicity of medical judgment is the most morally relevant factor. And I think it's not. I think there's nothing unique about not offering relative to stopping from a moral point of view. The architecture of the justifications is exactly the same. Yet in the socio-political landscape, in the legal landscape, and in the context of critical care, it doesn't seem to be read that way. But I do
And
think that highlights a contradiction.
it sort of calls to mind the equivalence thesis, which we talk about a lot in clinical ethics, that withholding and withdrawing medical interventions is ethically equivalent. But yet here in the case of code status, and clearly in the case that you encountered, a court is requiring you and is not seeing these two things as ethically equivalent. And then as we do slow codes and as we're performing, actually we're finding that we can't apply this equivalence thesis. And so what is it? Are they actually equivalent or are they not equivalent, right? And
Yeah,
it's finding out practically that maybe in practice they're not, though as ethicists in an ideal world, like you
right.
said, they would be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about the theoretical equivalence of those, but it's well known that they're, withholding and withdrawing are not perceived to be the same. And I think the same kind of um, difference in perception maps onto this question, right? Because what is different is not judgments about the effectiveness of CPR between, that happened before the attempt is started versus a minute in versus 2 minutes in versus 5 minutes in. That's not what's fundamentally different. What's fundamentally different is the ability to say we did something or we didn't do something. And that is, of course, starkly different.
Mhm.
Now, but that's a bit of a mirage as well, because if you believe CPR to be, if you have good reason in your medical judgment to believe CPR to be futile, then the mere fact that you compress someone's chest does not entitle you to the claim that you did something from a therapeutic point of view.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Thank you so much. I want to ask this question next. Slow codes are often discussed as a way to reduce moral distress when staff feel that full resuscitation would be non-beneficial. However, I've also seen slow codes create moral distress because nurses and other team members feel they intentionally did not provide the standard level of care and are left feeling they fell short of their professional obligations. How do we ethically reconcile these competing forms of moral distress when considering the use of slow codes?
Yeah, I think these are especially troubling but in cases where there reasonable people can disagree about the medical judgments, right? And so I would suggest that it's reasonable to err on the side of CPR if there is a genuine defensible medical judgment that it might be efficacious, then yeah, you're not in the space where slow codes might be operative or defensible. And for some of those reasons, right? They can promote moral distress. But I think in the kinds of cases at the end of this spectrum, where it's very clearly medically inappropriate or physiologically futile, the physiological condition of the patient is such that there's not a lot of dissent around the medical facts. We probably are leaning more into slow codes as a palliative for moral distress rather than provoking it. But it's a great point.
You're very clear that your argument is that slow codes are only ethically appropriate when you have external situations that are limiting clinical expertise, say like a court order or say we could say a hospital policy could perform this same. So if a hospital policy it does not allow for a physician directed DNR, this is when you think that slow codes would be acceptable.
Sure.
But I want to know, what do you think would be like if we're not facing that kind of scenario, but we do have conflict, what is the most appropriate way to address code status dilemmas in your perspective?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of strong, well-articulated, non-beneficial treatment policies that involve multidisciplinary review, which can be executed in a time-sensitive manner. And I think those are achievable and should be the sort of first line of defense on all of this.
So the argument that you're stating here is that the resuscitation is and should only be a medical judgment. And clinic or patients and families can express a preference, but the courts do not have an interest in dictating how clinicians exercise their judgment, if we can
Yeah.
be very clear.
Yeah, I guess to put it in common parlance, I don't think judges should be practicing medicine from the bench.
This last question that I'll ask as we run out of time is really interesting. With the frequency of slow codes, this person says, "Thank you for discussing this very relevant topic. If we can agree that slow codes are deceptive, but courts are going as far as mandating these codes, do you think there's any benefit in finding a way to at least increase their utility, as in letting trainees run these codes as a way to practice or as a way to practice chest compressions, intubations, and line placement?" Or would this raise additional ethical issues?
Yeah, it's not something I've thought extensively about in this particular context, but my intuitive reaction is that that provokes all sorts of new ethically troubling situations that have kind of a historical precedent. I don't think we want to dial up, using bodies for the purposes of demonstration and training and is I want to be cautious here because I've just been suspicious, if not critical, of the public trust arguments as it pertains to slow codes. But I think there's public trust arguments as pertains to practicing on patients for whom we shouldn't be doing things.
I want to recognize that we have met our hour. And so if you have to leave our live webinar, thank you for joining. We have some upcoming webinars that you can participate in. I do want to ask one more question for you, Jason. There's a lot of conversation about this in people who are at the end of life. What about in a neonatal situation or people in the beginning of life? Do you think that this kind of conversation applies to, say, babies who are born prematurely or babies who have, congenital abnormalities where resuscitation might not be indicated? But
Yeah,
we do genuinely don't know. We
right.
have a lot more uncertainty in those kinds of
Yeah, and
situations.
I think that's fundamentally what's different. So what I'll say is I think in principle, yes, but the evidence we have to get to the conclusion that we ought not to do this is quite a lot thinner in those contexts, and so probably less often. But I don't see in principle, like if we stipulate that we could um, prejudge a code attempt as futile or inappropriate. If we could stipulate that fairly based on the available evidence, then I would think the principle would apply. But it is much harder to do that in those contexts for sure.
And it would depend a lot. A clinical certainty would be really relevant, and the parental zone of discretion would be a highly appropriate thing to include in
Absolutely.
resuscitation in the
Yeah.
neonatal space, it sounds like.
Yeah,
Well, thank you
we
so
agree.
much, Dr. Wasserman. Your talk has created a lot of discussion, so many questions that we have not been able to answer them today. I encourage every attendee to continue to fill out the evaluations forms and rewatch this recording. There are so many complex, thoughtful issues that you discuss that a rewatch I think would be very helpful. So thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate your participation and your fantastic questions, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next Unpacking Bedside Bioethics or our next Ethics Grand Round session with the Center for Bioethics. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.